How's that? Is that better? Okay. There it is. I can hear it too. All right. Well, we were happy to be at your vacation Bible school, and we're always happy to be able to be with you at any opportunity. So it's our pleasure to be here tonight. Chad mentioned how long ago it was that we met, and that time just keeps going further and further back. And we were talking about that at home just the other night, how long ago it was when we first met Chad. And I guess it was when we were in school. Chad started about a year after we graduated, and so we've actually known him for over 20 years now, and that just seems strange to have friends from that long ago, all the way in adulthood at least. But tonight we're continuing, as Chad mentioned, y'all's theme on fireworks. And I looked through the other topics just to be sure, because I wanted to make sure I didn't overlap with anybody else, touch on anything that someone else was going to be dealing with. So I was looking, and the one that I have for tonight, one of the plagues, is the only one of the plagues mentioned that has anything to do with fire. And so nothing else is brought up about the plagues. And so we're going to talk a little bit more broadly, but we'll look specifically at this one plague that comes from Exodus chapter 9. But you remember the time of Egypt, and the great focus that's on Egypt in the Bible doesn't actually start in Exodus. It starts back in Joseph's day. Back toward the end of the book of Genesis, when Joseph is sold by his brothers into slavery, he is taken to Egypt and sold to Potiphar. And really at this time, that's where the great focus upon Egypt comes in. And Egypt is the center of focus for good reason. Not only is it the place where Joseph went and ends up bringing his whole family there during the time of the famine, but also this is significant because Egypt is the wealthy, powerful, influential kingdom of this time. It is the world power. It is the one that if you're looking at a map of the world, looking at all of these nations there, it stands out like the United States has for the last 100 or 150 years. I know the nation's been here longer than that, but there was a time of building and getting things up to the prosperity, the wealth, the influence, and the military, and all the things that America has been respected and feared and in some ways hated for over the years. And when we look at Egypt, the same things were in place there, much like with other kingdoms in the world's history. You remember Daniel and the big figure that was seen in Nebuchadnezzar's dream. And it talks about, of course, Babylon and the Medo-Persian kingdom, the Grecian kingdom, the Roman kingdom. You just keep going back and keep coming forward. And it's just one kingdom after another that comes to this type of world dominance and influence and wealth and power. Not literally conquering the world, but the most respected and thought of in the world. That's who Egypt was at this time. And Egypt had all of this influence and wealth and power, which made it very, very sensible then, as we're reading through the end of Genesis, that with Joseph's inspiration from God, with the revelation that God gave him, he was able to know that there was a famine coming to help them prepare for the famine, so that his family, as well as many other people, would migrate to Egypt during this time. And the Israelites grew. They not only came to Egypt, but because Joseph was so loved by Pharaoh, they were given the choicest place in the whole land, the land of Goshen. And the family of Abraham just kept growing, kept multiplying. And finally, in Exodus 1, we read that after Joseph had died, after that Pharaoh had died, there arose up another Pharaoh who knew not Joseph. And the whole picture began to change. Instead of Israel being blessed and being held up, being honored and being given all of these great things, now everything began to be taken from them. They began to be enslaved. They were used for labor, and it got to such a point that Pharaoh was afraid of their numbers and their might, so he ordered that their male children be thrown into the Nile River. Now you remember what the Nile River was to Egypt. The Nile River and the Syrian desert were the two main geographical features that the Egyptians dearly loved. The desert, which was on their eastern side, which would keep any enemies from ever trying to approach them that way. And then the Nile, which provided so much of their blessings, all of their crops, their animals, their own living, of course, but so much of their life came out of the Nile. And so it's very notable then that when the time comes that God says, it's time for my people to be freed, he sends Moses, an 80-year-old man, and his brother Aaron to go to Pharaoh. And you'll remember, as Moses had grown up in Pharaoh's own household, Moses would have known all of the workings of Egypt. He certainly would have known the workings of whatever type of palace, the life of the king, of the ruler. He would have known everything about this, every facet of it, having been raised in it and then walking away from it. This Moses comes back with Aaron to do the speaking for him. And as they come to Pharaoh, they come with a message from I am. Now, if you look back in Exodus, chapters 5 and 6, you're going to read some of the introductory parts of Moses and Aaron coming. And one of the things that God says to Moses, when Moses first asks him, who am I going to tell them sent me? He said, you tell them I am sent you. A little bit later, the Lord explains to Moses, you're going to be giving them a name that they've never heard before. Because Abraham and Isaac and Jacob knew me as God Almighty. But you're going to receive a name, and you're going to reveal a name to them that they're not familiar with. And the name, depending on which translation you're using, is either the Lord or Jehovah. A new name is being given here, being given that describes God, that shows them His character, shows them who He is. And He says, I want you to set this forth. Why at this time is God going to reveal a new name, a new designation for Himself? Because God is about to set Himself up in the eyes of Israel, in the eyes of Egypt, and in the eyes of the whole world, not only right now, but for many generations to come, as the God of heaven and earth, as the Lord, the only one. You remember the state of affairs spiritually in Egypt. They had a multiplicity of gods. They did not have an idea, a concept of one God who was the God of their heaven and earth. They had no concept of that whatsoever. It's like today when we walk out on the streets and we start talking about the church. We have to be careful how we designate, how we describe, what we give as a name, because it is inconceivable to most people today to think of church and not think of denominationalism, not think of all the multiple denominations that are out there in what we understand is a perversion of the truth. But they see it as simply all the different parts of Christianity. So we have to be very descriptive. We have to be very biblical in our speaking to help people understand what the church is. The same problem was going on in Egypt with the concept of God. They needed to know who the God of heaven and earth was, who the Lord was, who Jehovah was. He was not just the God of Israel. Now, He was the God of Israel, but He was not just the God of Israel. He was also the God of everyone. He should have been. But so many others had chosen to turn in different directions, and this is true as we come down looking at Egypt. They had gods for everything. If you've ever been to India or studied anything about Hinduism, you see a lot of similarities in their approach to looking for deities. They find a god everywhere they look. When they look at a rock, they see a god. When they look at a tree, they see a god. When they look at an animal, they see a god. When they look up and see the sun, the moon, the stars, anything that is of note, anything that really gets their attention, they ascribe a god to it. And that's what was happening in Egypt. And so look, if you will, for just a few moments at a few of these plagues leading up to the one we're studying tonight. And we're going to see the pictures that these people had in mind about their gods. In the first of the plagues, you'll remember that there was a warning given that the water was going to be turned to blood. All of the waters of the Nile. And it said not only were they turned to blood, but all the fish, all the things that lived in the water and depended on the water for life died. Now, you realize what a blow this would be, because they already had Hapt, the Nile goddess. They had Nut, the celestial stream from which the Nile flows. Osiris, the god of the underworld, whose bloodstream is the Nile. Satet, the goddess of the annual inundation, the crops and things. Anquet, the personification of the Nile, Mut, the mother of all things, Isis Sothis, representing the fruit of the Nile, Isis Hathon, the benefactor of the world, Ames, the productive power of nature. Think of all the gods that would have been affected from their mindset by turning the waters of the Nile into blood and killing everything that lived in it. Now think about what else that would impact. They thought that the crocodiles were sacred. They thought that certain fish were sacred. They thought that certain serpents were sacred. They thought that frogs were sacred. How many things living in the Nile were being affected? And how would this first plague have affected the mindset of these people who thought that all of these gods had utmost power and control in at least these individual areas? And then to see what a slap in the face this would be to understand that there's a God out there who has more power than all of them. From the very first plague, there were multiple gods of Egypt who would have been put out of place, who would have been shown as false. But it didn't stop there. They were not only warned about the first plague, then they were warned about a second plague, about frogs. And you remember when Moses spoke the words and when the miracle happened, the plague happened, and the water turned to blood, Pharaoh brought his magicians, brought his tricksters out, and they imitated what Moses had done. They made water turn into blood. Well, then when Moses told them about the second plague, they had a warning there, and all of a sudden the frogs start coming from the river. Frogs that come into their homes, frogs that come everywhere. The numbers of frogs would have been staggering. So much so that once the plague was finished and Moses went out and entreated God and all the frogs died, that they took them out and piled them up in heaps, and the heaps were so large of dead frogs that it says the whole land stank because of it. It says that Pharaoh's magicians were able to bring frogs too. They brought some frogs and did something similar. They imitated what Moses had done. Well, then you come to the third plague, which was lice. Now, this would be a particularly offensive plague because lice to an Egyptian, much like to us today, means there's a problem with cleanliness. There's a problem there that has allowed lice to come upon a person, and they would consider themselves spiritually, ceremonially unclean. And if you were unclean, then you were not fit to worship and serve your gods. So to be unclean was a horrible ordeal to them. And they were stricken with lice all through the land. The magicians couldn't duplicate this. You'll notice they were warned about the blood. They were warned about the frogs. Then they were not warned about the lice. It just happened. And this time the magicians could not duplicate it. He went on a little bit further with the next plague of flies. Remember, the fly was also one of the sacred creatures. They had a god figure that was built after the resemblance of a fly. And so they were inundated with flies. Now, I know where we live, there are cattle around us and horses and chicken houses and things down around there. And so every once in a while during the summer, the gnats will come. Not really the house flies so much as the gnats. And they get so numerous sometimes, it's an irritation. We can't stand them. We try to keep them out of the house as best we can. When they get into the house, you've got to have several different devised ways to try to kill them and keep them out of everything. It's an irritation. How would you like to have flies that were so much worse than an irritation that would be called a plague that you couldn't keep out? That you couldn't shut the door and bar the way. You couldn't have a home. You couldn't have a place of rest. You couldn't go anywhere without being covered with flies. The magicians were out of their realm. God brought the flies and God took them away. In the fifth plague, here's another difficulty for them with their gods, because the Egyptians, much like Hindus today, worshiped cattle. You remember this was a type of worship that Israel picked up while they were in the land of Egypt, because when they left, it was not very far that they had gotten removed from Egypt before they built a golden calf and were worshiping it. So this is something that was very prevalent throughout the land. But when the murrain of cattle came, and their animals began to die. They saw once again the power of God over Hathor, the cow goddess, Apis, the sacred bull, Nut, the sky goddess, all these ones that they thought should be protecting their animals because they were sacred, had no power at all when it came to God, of course. In the sixth plague, the people were overcome with boils. And by this point, of course, the plagues were not happening in the land of Goshen. A few of the starting plagues happened in Goshen as well. But now the plagues are not happening in Goshen. They're not happening to Israel. Now they're just all around everywhere else in Egypt. And the people, even those magicians, their priests, were stricken with boils. I've never had boils. I've heard people describe them, and having boils is not something that anyone would look forward to. I remember reading about Job having boils from the crown of his head to the soles of his feet. And you remember he was in such a state physically that he took a piece of broken pottery and was scraping himself to get rid of those boils. I can't imagine what kind of pain those would have to cause so that you'd be willing to scrape them off with something like broken glass in order to get them off of you, causing horrible pain, trying to get rid of other horrible pain. But all the people were stricken with boils. We're going to pass over the seventh plague for a moment because we're coming back to that. In the eighth plague, we read about the locusts, of course. The hail that had come in the seventh plague that was destroying the crops, destroying people, animals, if they stayed outside. They were warned about it. They were warned it was coming, and they were told to get inside. When Moses spoke to Pharaoh, Pharaoh had opportunity to warn the Egyptians and tell them to be inside, because everybody that was outside died with the animals, and the crops, at least part of the crops, were being destroyed. But then another plague comes right on the heels of that one. The locusts come in. And Moses warns them again and says the locusts are coming, and what was left by the hail is going to be devoured by the locusts. They're going to tear up everything else. They're going to eat and destroy everything that's left standing. And then, of course, when the locusts are taken away, the next plague, the ninth one, there's no warning about this one, darkness. Darkness which comes that is so dark, it's a thick darkness, a darkness that can be felt. Have you ever been in a cave before? I know it gets darker outside at night, but it's never really completely dark out here where we walk around. Even when the moon is new and it's not really putting forth much reflection at all, and even when it's cloudy on we call it a moonless night, a new moon and a cloudy night, there's still some light out there. Your eyes can still adjust, and you get to where you can see somewhat. But if you've ever gone down into a cave, you know what real darkness is. Once you get down underground where there's no light, no reflection, nothing going on, and it's so dark that you can poke yourself in the eye and not see the finger that's doing it, then you know probably what these people were feeling. And the fact that they felt it for 3 days, 72 hours, without any light whatsoever. You know, the chief of their gods was Ra. And a few more that came in rank in their thinking right under Ra was Amun-Ra, and then, let's see, a couple more, Aten, Atum, Horus, Thoth, sun gods, and the moon god. These were the ones that they considered to be above all the others because they were the gods of the heavenly bodies, the ones who were above the earth, the ones who were beyond this world. And so in their thinking, these were the highest ranking of the gods. And even though they were supposed to be gods of the sun and of the moon, the God of Israel, Jehovah, had the power to turn the lights out and leave them in utter darkness for 3 days. Of course, the plague that finally brought Pharaoh to his knees to the point of telling Moses to take Israel and get out was the morning when they woke up and their firstborn, in every household, the firstborn was dead. This, again, did not happen among Israel because Israel had been given very explicit instructions in chapters 11 and 12 of Exodus. Very great instructions about how to prepare the sacrifice, the sacrificial lamb, the blood, where it was to be placed, how they were to deal with the body, what they were to cook and eat. Everything. And then they were even told, make sure you have your shoes on and latched. Make sure you've borrowed gold from the Egyptians. Make sure that you've got everything in order, because when this night is completed and this plague is done, Pharaoh is going to force you out of here. He's going to send you out of here with strength. Where before he's been always holding back and always keeping you in, it's going to be at this plague that he is thrusting you out of the land. He's going to be finished with this, but not completely finished. We'll look at that a little bit more as we go further in this lesson. Back to chapter 9. During the course of all of these plagues, you can see by looking at each of them quickly and seeing how this would tie to their gods, their false gods, all the difficulties they would have there in their spiritual thinking of why their gods could not protect them and preserve all of the things that were being destroyed and tainted by these plagues. And then the physical suffering they were going through, because every one of these plagues had some part of great suffering that brought torment to them in one way or another. And over and over and over again, they are being confronted and overcome by the God of Moses, the God of Israel, the God of their slave people, the God whose name Jehovah is now being put forth. They are being overcome and thwarted by this God at every turn. They don't have anybody, even Pharaoh himself by the 10th plague, Pharaoh who was considered a god by the people, even Pharaoh himself could not overcome this God of Israel, because the firstborn died in his house too. He's not only suffered through all the other plagues with the people, but the firstborn in his house died too. During all of this, we read about this one particular plague where fire is brought out. In chapter 9, as Moses has warned them about the hail that's coming, beginning in verse 13, it comes down to verse 22. The Lord said to Moses, "Stretch out your hand toward heaven, that there may be hail in all the land of Egypt, on man, on beast, and on every herb of the field throughout the land of Egypt." And Moses stretched out his rod toward heaven, and the Lord sent thunder and hail, and fire darted to the ground, and the Lord rained hail on the land of Egypt. So there was hail and fire mingled with the hail, so very heavy that there was none like it in all the land of Egypt, since it became a nation. And the hail struck throughout the whole land of Egypt, all that was in the field, both man and beast. And the hail struck every herb of the field and broke every tree of the field. Only in the land of Goshen, where the children of Israel were, there was no hail. Can you imagine seeing what was going on here? We've probably all seen hail. I've been in hailstorms in places where it came down so hard that it damaged houses and dented cars, and I'm sure you've seen that too. There have been reports of hail just in the last year or two in this country where hail the size of baseballs fell. How'd you like to get hit on the head by one of those? I remember when I was in the military one time, we were out in the field and a hailstorm came up. It was golf ball sized hail. And we were sitting up under trees, the biggest trees we could find, so the limbs would break up a lot of it. And we put our helmets on and hunkered down, put packs up over you, whatever you could do, because it would just beat you up if you were out in the open. This hail was such that it was killing people. It was killing animals. And it was tearing down and destroying crops. But not only was it the hail that was falling from the sky, but also it says that there were thunderings and there was fire mingled with the hail. Now, some renderings of this, whether you're reading in other translations or reading from commentators, some say that this was lightning coming down just like it would normally in a big storm. I tend to think that's probably a good idea. That it was lightning coming down, because what is the produce of excessive lightning? It's fire. When lightning strikes, when there's a lot of lightning strikes in the midst of ammunition for a fire, things that are combustible, things that can burn, the result is you get fires. Forest fires get started because of lightning. House fires get started because of lightning. We've seen all kinds of fires that come due to lightning. So it stands to reason then, as God is using the things of nature, that he would bring lightning down with this great storm, and the result of this lightning is that there's fire. Now you tell me what fire does to crops. We know exactly. When you have hail beating crops down to the ground, and you have fire that's coming from the lightning and running along with the ground, then you've got complete and utter destruction, at least he explains, of certain crops. Now, why some crops and not others? Because crops that are going to be knocked down by hail and that are going to be burned by fire are going to be crops that are already standing. But when you've got seedling crops that are just coming up, the hail or the fire may not harm them. But guess what will? Locusts. Anything that's coming along as a young crop that escapes the destruction of the hail and the fire is going to be eaten up by the locusts so that there's nothing left. What God did here was a very strong statement against the gods of Egypt, against the king of Egypt. And he made this point that not only right now are you suffering from this, but you're going to suffer in the months to come, in the year to come. Because now you're not going to get any of the crops that are ready to harvest. You're not going to get the next batch of crops that are just now coming up and getting started. You're going to suffer for a while. He was bringing some great calamity on them. Remember, this all started with a command. A command. Let my people go. 7 times from chapter 5 to chapter 10, we read that statement of command being delivered by Moses to Pharaoh, that the I am, Jehovah, the God of Israel, said, let my people go. Now you tell me, who would still stand against this God after plague 1? Even when your magicians could do something that looked similar, why would you stand against the one who could bring a destruction upon the river Nile? Why would you keep standing when this God brought the frogs upon the land, so much so that even when they were finally killed and could be dragged out and piled up, the land stinks from the numbers of them? Who would still be standing against him after the lice had come, after the boils, after the murrain of cattle? Who would still be resisting this God? You'll remember before the command was delivered the first time, God told Moses he's not going to do it. He's not going to relent. He's not going to let them go, but I still want you to go and give the command. And do you remember God's assessment of Pharaoh? Knowing that Pharaoh was going to say no, that he was not going to give in, knowing that he would stand with resistance against God, but God telling Moses to go deliver the message anyway, God said, I'm going to harden his heart. This is a big discussion that comes up sometimes. Several times throughout this text it says that the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart. But then several times it also says Pharaoh hardened his own heart. This is not a contradiction. This is not something that's going in 2 different directions. It's showing the parallel of the opportunity and the resistance. God gave the opportunity for Pharaoh to either obey or resist. So in that sense, God placed this before him. So from that perspective, God hardened his heart. But the choice was always left up to Pharaoh. The choice was always his. Otherwise, God sending the command was just a ruse. Otherwise, it was all just a big sham. And God was only holding Egypt there just to make this big point. Now, God said, I'm going to make a point out of this. A point to Egypt, a point to Israel, and a point for the rest of the world. But he still sent the command. He could have brought the plagues and shown his power without commanding, without dealing with Pharaoh. He didn't have to do all of that. He could have brought calamity and destruction and plagues upon them, one after another, still showing them who he was, still showing his superiority over their false gods, without ever having anybody talk to Pharaoh. The point that Moses was making, or that God was making by sending Moses to Pharaoh, was that Pharaoh had a choice. And he kept choosing to go against God. Time and time again. 7 times that commandment is made. Let my people go. Do you remember the compromises that Pharaoh began to come up with? He didn't want to let God's people go. He didn't want to turn them loose. He didn't want them going out of the land because he remembered all of the work that the Israelites were doing for the Egyptians. Remember, they were making all of the bricks for them. I marvel sometimes at the amount of information that's given about the work that was being done during this time. You remember during Joseph's time, there was enough technology, enough understanding of sciences and crops and storage, and that they could prepare for a 7-year famine. Do you know we can't store grain any longer than they could back then? Today, with all the advancements in technology that we have, with agricultural engineering, with all the things, we can't store grain for 20 years. Not whole grain. Now you can process it and change it and put preservatives in it, but you can't store whole grain for that long. It's going to go bad. They were able to store grain and store up enough food to carry themselves and everybody who migrated there for 7 years. These people knew what they were doing. They were advanced. But when it came to dealing with God and dealing with His people, they had a workhorse. You're going to make bricks. And so they did. Finally, when the difficulties were arising and they wanted to oppress them even more, they made them gather their own materials for the bricks. They were providing it for them. Then they started making them gather their own, and they hated the idea of losing all of that labor. Do you know how many structures are still standing in Egypt that are made from brick? That if archaeologists keep looking at and keep studying, keep working with, no doubt they're going to find that some of those were probably built by the bricks that the Israelites were making. It's no wonder that they have the Great Sphinx. It's no wonder that they have the pyramids. These were advanced people. And they had slave workers who were doing a great task and toil for them, and they didn't want to let them go. The first compromise, after the command of let my people go and God showing His power, the first compromise that Pharaoh came up with was, why don't you worship your God in the land? You remember the demand of God was, let me take all my people, all their things, and let them leave so that they can worship me. Pharaoh's first offering to Moses was, all of your people, everything, do that, just do it in the land. Don't leave. Don't leave Egypt. Do it right here. You can still worship your God. You can do everything you want to do. You just do it in this land. Of course, what God wanted was the freedom of His people. Not an allowed worship and then right back into slavery, right back into the works they were doing. He wanted them to be free from this bondage, to be free from this land. There was a land that God had already promised to Israel, that He had promised to Abraham and to Isaac and to Jacob. And if you remember, all of them had already been in and dwelt in this land. And it was because of the famine that Jacob and the rest of the family left the area of Canaan and came down into Egypt, and why they settled there in Goshen and dwelt there for all of these years. But now it's time for them to go back to that land, to inhabit it, to dwell there, to have the promise that God had given through Abraham long ago. And so God wanted them free. Pharaoh's first compromise was, of course you can worship your God, just do it in this land. What would that have done? You remember what Moses brought up when this was first offered by Pharaoh? Moses said, how's this going to go? We want to worship our God. You say worship Him in the land. A huge part of our worship to God is going to be building an altar and offering cattle, offering the blood of animals, offering the bodies of these animals that you worship. How's that going to go over in your land? When we're killing animals that you think are sacred so that we can offer them in sacrifice to our God. This isn't going to work. First he said, just stay here in the land. The next compromise he offered was, just don't go too far. In chapter 8, verse 28, you can take them and go, but don't go very far. Go just a little ways. I'll let you go out of the land so you can worship your God without being right under our thumb, but as soon as you're done, you come right back in. You can go, just don't go too far. Compromise. Of course, Moses rejected this compromise as well. Then later in chapter 10, verses 7 through 11, Pharaoh offered another compromise. Okay, you can go however far, whatever you want to go do, but only take the men. Leave your women and children here. Just the men. That's really all that's needed, right? Just for the men to go and worship and do that. The women and children don't matter so much. Well, they mattered to the Israelites. They mattered to God. No matter what the Egyptian concept was there. Of course, Moses rejected this compromise as well. And then lastly, in chapter 10, verses 24 through 6, Pharaoh told Moses, you take your people and go worship God, but leave all your possessions, all of your herds, your flocks, all of your animals, leave them here. Don't take everybody and everything, just take everybody, because if we've got all your things, you'll come back for them. And that's when the statement came out that has been repeated and used so often over the years in teaching about this, when Moses said, not a hoof shall be left behind. We're not leaving one single thing in this land. When we go, we're taking everybody and everything. Of course, by the end of this 10th plague, everything changed. On the morning that the angel passed over the land, passed over Goshen and the Israelites, because they had put blood on the lintel, on the doorposts. They had prepared and eaten the Passover lamb. They had their shoes on. They had their things gathered. They were ready to go. And on that morning, when Pharaoh awoke to the dead firstborn in his house, and no doubt very quickly the reports from every house in Egypt. Now, we've all been aware of times in this world because of famine, war, disease, where lots of people have died very quickly. But there's never been another time in this world where so many firstborns died all at once. Or has there? You remember it was just 80 years earlier when the Pharaoh of Egypt had told them to take every child, every male child that was born to the Hebrews and throw them in the river. You remember when Moses was born? It was because of a mother and father who had faith, Hebrews 11 tells us, that Moses was hidden and spared and ended up growing up in Pharaoh's own house. But the rest of Moses' generation of male children that were being born were being thrown into the river. By the 10th plague, God says, I'm going to take the firstborn of every house. So when they wake up in the morning, Pharaoh says, take the people, take the animals, take everything, and get out. They leave. They haven't gone far. By the time you read through Israel running, traveling, going toward the Red Sea, the Egyptian army under Pharaoh's leadership, pursuing them right up to the Red Sea. The sea, of course, being parted by the Lord, the wind blowing, them going through on dry ground, Pharaoh and his army pursuing them through on dry ground until they got in the midst of the sea. And then God made the wheels fall off their chariots, burdened them down where they couldn't move anymore, and then caused the sea to collapse back on them and drown them all. By the time they came out on the other side and continued their journey, it says that a month and a half had gone by. A month and 15 days into the next month had gone by as they were continuing their journey. By the time you get to the third month after the journey, they are at Mount Sinai. By the time you're at the third month, they have entered the area of Sinai. Moses goes up. Joshua goes partway with him. He goes up into the mountain and is up there. You'll remember he recounts later, gives us later the details in Deuteronomy about how he was up there for 40 days and 40 nights. And when he had been up there for such a long time, the Israelites said, he's not coming back. Moses went up in the mountain. He's left us. He's got to be dead if he's not back by now. Aaron, make us a golden calf. And do you remember what happened when Aaron took the gold from them? He said, bring me the gold. Remember all the gold that God told them to take from the Egyptians? Aaron was saying, bring me your gold. So they brought the earrings, they brought the gold that they had, and they brought it to him, and he cast it into the fire and melted it down. And then it tells us very specifically that he took a tool and he shaped and formed the golden calf. That's not what he told Moses when Moses came down and confronted him. He told Moses, the people wanted it, so they brought me their gold, I threw it in the fire, and out popped this golden calf. Oh no. In Exodus 32 we read that Aaron carefully fashioned the golden calf, made it with a tool, and then set it up before the people. And do you remember what the description that was given to this golden calf? These be the gods that brought you up out of Egypt. You remember in Exodus 20 when God was giving the commands that were put on the tables of stone? Not all of the commands that were given to Israel, 10 commandments. That was not all of the law. Don't ever let anybody say the 10 commandments was the old law. That was one part of what was given. In those he said, thou shalt have no other gods before me. He also said, thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image. You know, God did not want them looking to other gods, but God also did not want them fashioning some physical image and trying to bind him up in it. God had just given them a 10-stage display of who Jehovah really is. And in less than 4 months, even the children of Israel had turned back to the golden calf. From the command that was given to the compromises that Pharaoh offered, then we look to and see the concession that Pharaoh makes, get them and get out. And then the final consequence, even with all of those pictures of God's greatness, the difficulties that were still in Egypt and in Israel with the false gods that surrounded them. Let us not be so blind as those people, but let us hold on to Jehovah, the true God of heaven and earth. Thank you so much.